The agricultural landscape of Europe is experiencing an unprecedented wave of protest and civil unrest that has captured the attention of citizens, policymakers, and observers worldwide. What began as isolated demonstrations by frustrated farmers has evolved into a continent-wide movement that challenges the very foundations of European Union agricultural policy, trade agreements, and the future of food production across the region. This phenomenon represents far more than simple economic grievances. It embodies deep-seated concerns about sovereignty, cultural identity, environmental policy, and the survival of a way of life that has sustained European communities for generations. The images emerging from cities like Brussels, Paris, Berlin, and London tell a powerful story. Thousands of tractors converging on capital cities, farmers blockading highways, protesters confronting riot police, and agricultural workers from diverse nations uniting under a common cause. These demonstrations reflect a fundamental crisis in the relationship between Europe's farming communities and the political institutions that govern them. To fully understand this movement, we must examine its roots, its demands, its methods, and its potential implications for the future of European agriculture and the European Union itself. To comprehend the current crisis, we must first understand the historical development of agricultural policy within the European framework. The Common Agricultural Policy, CAP, established in 1962, was one of the first major policy initiatives of the European Economic Community, the predecessor to the modern European Union. The CAP was designed with multiple objectives: ensuring a stable food supply for Europe's population, providing a fair standard of living for agricultural communities, stabilizing markets, guaranteeing food security, and ensuring reasonable prices for consumers. For decades, the CAP dominated the EU budget, at times accounting for more than 70% of total European community spending. The policy implemented various mechanisms, including price supports, production quotas, export subsidies, and direct payments to farmers. These interventions transformed European agriculture, increasing productivity, modernizing farming techniques, and creating food surpluses that made Europe self-sufficient and even a net exporter of many agricultural products. However, the CAP also generated significant controversies. Critics argued that it distorted global agricultural markets, benefited large-scale industrial farms over small family operations, encouraged overproduction and environmental degradation, and consumed an unsustainable portion of the EU budget. These criticisms led to numerous reforms over the decades, each attempting to balance the competing demands of productivity, sustainability, market efficiency, and rural development. The most recent reforms have increasingly emphasized environmental objectives, incorporating climate change mitigation, biodiversity protection, and sustainable farming practices into the policy framework. The European Green Deal, announced in 2019, and its associated farm-to-fork strategy, represent the most ambitious environmental agenda ever applied to European agriculture. These initiatives aim to reduce pesticide use by 50%, decrease fertilizer application by 20%, expand organic farming to 25% of agricultural land, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, all by 2030. While these environmental objectives enjoy support among urban populations and environmental advocacy groups, many farmers view them as existential threats to their livelihoods. The transition costs are substantial, the economic viability remains uncertain, and farmers feel that they are being asked to shoulder disproportionate burdens in the name of environmental progress, while other sectors face less stringent requirements. Central to the current wave of protests is opposition to the proposed EU-Mercosur free trade agreement. Mercosur is a South American trade bloc consisting of Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay, representing a combined market of over 260 million people and one of the world's most productive agricultural regions. The proposed agreement, which has been negotiated on and off for over 2 decades, would create one of the world's largest free trade zones, eliminating tariffs on most goods and services between the European Union and Mercosur countries. For European consumers and many industries, the agreement promises lower prices, expanded markets, and economic growth. European automobile manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, and machinery producers would gain preferential access to South American markets. Consumers would benefit from lower prices on agricultural commodities, including beef, poultry, sugar, and other products where South American producers enjoy significant cost advantages due to climate, land availability, and lower regulatory burdens. However, European farmers view the agreement with alarm and outright hostility. They argue that South American agricultural products are produced under fundamentally different regulatory frameworks that permit practices banned or restricted in Europe. These include the use of pesticides prohibited in the EU, growth hormones in livestock production, lower animal welfare standards, and less stringent environmental regulations. Farmers contend that they cannot compete economically with imports produced under these conditions, while simultaneously being required to meet increasingly stringent European environmental and welfare standards. The beef sector provides a particularly stark example. European beef producers operate under strict regulations governing animal welfare, veterinary care, feeding practices, antibiotic use, and environmental impact. These requirements increase production costs significantly compared to South American competitors. Brazilian beef production, for instance, benefits from extensive grazing on vast pastures, lower labor costs, and less restrictive regulatory environments. European farmers argue that flooding European markets with South American beef would devastate their industry, leading to farm closures, rural depopulation, and loss of food sovereignty. Environmental groups add another dimension to opposition to the agreement, pointing out that South American beef production is associated with Amazon rainforest deforestation, habitat destruction, and significant greenhouse gas emissions. They argue that the agreement contradicts Europe's climate commitments and would effectively export environmental damage to South America, while undermining European farmers who are being asked to adopt more sustainable practices. The political dynamics surrounding the agreement are complex. The European Commission, led by President Ursula von der Leyen, has expressed support for finalizing the agreement, emphasizing economic benefits and geopolitical advantages of strengthening ties with South America. However, several member states, including France, Ireland, Austria, and Poland, have expressed opposition or serious reservations, particularly regarding agricultural provisions. The agreement requires ratification by the European Parliament and approval by all member states, making its ultimate fate uncertain. For farmers protesting in Brussels and other European capitals, the Mercosur agreement symbolizes a broader pattern of policymaking that they perceive as disconnected from agricultural realities, prioritizing abstract economic models and corporate interests over the survival of family farms and rural communities. The protests that converged on Brussels in December 2024 represent perhaps the most dramatic manifestation of agricultural discontent in recent European history. Estimates suggest that approximately 10,000 protesters and up to 1,000 tractors descended on the Belgian capital, creating scenes of extraordinary visual and political power. The protesters came from across the European Union. French farmers driving tractors hundreds of kilometers from their farms, Belgian agricultural workers defending their local interests, German farmers expressing solidarity, and representatives from numerous other member states. The scale and intensity of these demonstrations caught many observers by surprise, though those familiar with rural Europe had been tracking growing discontent for months. The protests were not spontaneous eruptions, but rather carefully coordinated actions organized through agricultural unions, farmer cooperatives, and increasingly through social media networks that allowed rapid mobilization and coordination across borders. The protesters positioned themselves strategically, with some demonstrations occurring within 50 meters of EU headquarters buildings, creating powerful symbolic confrontations between agricultural workers and the institutions they hold responsible for their difficulties. The presence of tractors, the quintessential symbol of farming, transformed highways and urban streets into visual statements of agricultural power and rural anger. Reports indicate that tensions escalated at various points, with police deploying water cannons and tear gas to control crowds and prevent protesters from breaching security perimeters around sensitive government buildings. The use of force against farmers became itself a point of controversy, with protest supporters arguing